Today, we're here to announce federal criminal charges against Eugene Henley Jr., a career criminal known as Big U, who used his contacts and leadership role in the Crips criminal street gang, the entertainment industry, and a youth charity to further his own criminal.
Federal agents stepped up to the podium and said a name the hip-hop world knows too well. Eugene Big U Henley Jr., charged, indicted, accused of leading a criminal enterprise. And almost immediately, Blacc Sam responded. Not with a rant, not with threats, not with the kind of emotional reaction the internet expected. Just a measured statement that carried the weight of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. The kind of response that only makes sense when you understand the history behind it. And that history goes back decades. To mentorship, to loyalty, to a physical confrontation that fractured everything, and to wiretapped phone calls that prosecutors say reveal what was really being said behind closed doors. But before any of that, you need to understand what federal prosecutors actually charged, and why RICO cases hit different than anything street politics can produce. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, isn't built to catch one bad moment. It's built to dismantle systems. Prosecutors don't use it unless they believe there's an organized structure behind a pattern of criminal activity. Not one fight, not one threat. A connected pattern directed through leadership. These cases take years to build. Surveillance, financial tracking, wiretaps, informants, and by the time charges are announced, the government believes it has something strong enough to survive in court. Convictions under RICO don't end with probation. They end with decades, sometimes life. That's the difference between street consequences and federal consequences. So when prosecutors announced racketeering charges against Big U, alleging extortion, fraud, intimidation, and violence as tools of an alleged enterprise, this wasn't gossip reaching a courtroom. This was years of federal work landing on one name. And that name carried history that the indictment alone couldn't fully explain. Eugene Big U Henley Jr. wasn't just another street figure in South Los Angeles. Inside the rolling 60s neighborhood Crips, he was considered an influential presence, someone younger members looked to for direction. But he didn't present himself only as a street figure. He ran a youth football league. He mentored kids. He appeared at community events as someone trying to create bridges between the neighborhood and legitimate opportunity. He built relationships with artists, executives, and athletes. Some saw him as protection. Some saw him as guidance. That dual identity, community figure and street authority, is what made him powerful in environments where influence means moving between worlds. The block, the boardroom, the youth center, the label office, Big U had presence in all of it. And that presence extended to a young rapper from Crenshaw who was just beginning to find his lane. In Nipsey Hussle's early years, Big U wasn't an enemy. He was an ally. Reports described Big U as someone who opened his home to Nipsey during those early years. Not as a celebrity, just as a young artist trying to stay focused. In neighborhoods like that, having an established OG offer his roof means protection and validation. Big U also reportedly allowed Nipsey to record in his space and was connected to his early music efforts through unique music. Studio access, business structure, industry entry points, that kind of backing in the early 2000s LA rap scene could determine whether a career started or stalled. But mentorship inside street culture carries unspoken expectations. When someone invests in you, time, reputation, connections, there's an assumed understanding about loyalty and how you move once you start gaining traction. And as Nipsey began growing, the nature of that growth created friction that wasn't visible from the outside. Because Nipsey wasn't trying to be another artist attached to an OG's platform, he was thinking ownership, masters, his own store on Crenshaw, his own brand independent of anyone else's structure. That kind of independent thinking inspires people, but it can also unsettle established hierarchies. When someone you helped rise starts building real independent influence, it can feel like a challenge to the order that once existed. What started as mentorship slowly became distance, and in environments where hierarchy and respect define everything, distance can be interpreted as disrespect. Then 2011 brought everything to a head. According to reports from that period, a confrontation between Nipsey and Big U escalated into a physical altercation in South Los Angeles. Accounts described a significant mismatch. Big U older, bigger, carrying established authority. Nipsey younger, still building his name. Blacc Sam intervened. Reports indicate he discharged a firearm into the air to break up the situation. Police arrived immediately, and what followed is the detail that stayed with people who knew the story. Big U, the aggressor in the physical confrontation, walked away without charges. Blacc Sam, who stepped in to protect his brother, faced legal consequences instead. That outcome hardened everything. Once a confrontation reaches that level, family forced into it publicly, legal consequences landing on the person who tried to stop it, there's no returning to quiet tension. The bond that once existed fractured permanently. And in street culture, fractured bonds don't fade. They harden into something that can sit unresolved for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. For a long time, it stayed beneath the surface. Nipsey kept building, the Marathon clothing store opened, the community investments grew, the music reached global audiences. Big U continued operating in his lanes, but the history between them didn't disappear. It waited. And according to federal prosecutors, it was still waiting years after Nipsey was gone. Inside the federal indictment, alongside the racketeering language, were references to recorded phone calls. Two calls in particular became the detail that ignited social media when the paperwork started circulating. The first, dated December 31st, 2022, more than 3 years after Nipsey's death, allegedly captured Big U claiming he was bigger than Nipsey and referencing having disciplined him in the past. Competitive, territorial. That language, coming years after Nipsey was no longer alive to respond, landed heavily. The second call, dated January 1st, 2023, allegedly captured Big U stating that anyone who beefs with him would be killed. Now the critical distinction, and it matters, Big U is not charged with Nipsey's murder. Eric Holder was convicted in state court and is serving a life sentence. That case is legally separate and closed. What federal prosecutors are doing with these calls is different. They're establishing a pattern of alleged behavior. They're using the language to demonstrate a mindset that violence and intimidation were allegedly tools used to maintain power and control, not isolated moments of anger. In RICO cases, prosecutors don't just prove individual acts. They prove enterprise behavior. They argue that alleged crimes were connected and directed through leadership over time. These calls, in that context, aren't just inflammatory statements. They're pieces of a pattern prosecutors are laying out for a jury. And when that pattern involves a name as significant as Nipsey Hussle's, spoken about in that tone years after his death, the culture reacted the way it always does when old wounds get reopened publicly. Which is why Blacc Sam's response carried so much weight. For years after March 31st, 2019, Sam stayed disciplined. He didn't chase every rumor. He didn't fuel speculation. He didn't turn grief into content. His focus was legacy, the Marathon brand, the community work, carrying forward what his brother built. So when the indictment dropped and those alleged wiretap statements started spreading, people watched to see how he'd respond. He didn't escalate. He didn't accuse beyond what the documents already said. He didn't perform grief for an audience. His response carried something quieter and heavier, the tone of someone who had been watching carefully for a long time, trusting that patience would eventually bring accountability to whatever needed to be accounted for. You could sense that this wasn't surprise. It felt like confirmation of things he had already carried privately for years. He was there in 2011. He was there when the confrontation happened, and he paid legal consequences for stepping in. He was there during every year Nipsey spent building independence against forces that may not have wanted that independence to grow. And he was there on the day everything ended. So when federal prosecutors laid out an alleged pattern of intimidation connected to someone from that same history, Sam didn't need to perform a reaction. The paperwork was loud enough on its own. The legal process will now take its course. Evidence will be argued. The defense will have its turn. Allegations are not convictions, and that distinction matters. What prosecutors claim in an indictment still has to survive a courtroom. But something has already shifted that no verdict can undo. The questions that lived in barbershops and comment sections for years now have federal language attached to them. The tension that people speculated about privately is now being argued in court documents. And the contrast at the center of it all, a man who preached ownership, independence, and breaking cycles against allegations of control, intimidation, and fear as leverage, is now impossible to look away from. The marathon was always about building something that couldn't be taken. This indictment is about whether forces that once helped shape that vision were also quietly working against it. That question doesn't get answered by a press conference. It gets answered in federal court.